Okay, great. While folks continue to trickle in, we'll go ahead and get started. We can go to the next slide. So I'd just like to welcome you all to day 2 of part 2 of our Salinity Management Workshop, our March 2024 meetings on the topic. My name is Dylan Chappell. I'm an Environmental Program Manager at the Delta Stewardship Council, and I'm really happy to welcome you all to our event today. So we can go to the next slide. So I think many of you joining us today were here yesterday, but for those of you who weren't able to attend, just wanted to orient us before we jump into some of the details for our day, orient us around some of our shared project goals that inform the work that we'll be talking about today. So the first overarching goal is to build a shared understanding of the range of issues associated with ocean salt intrusion in the Delta, the different salinity management tools and strategies that could be used in response to drought conditions and other climate change factors, and the impacts and trade-offs associated with these. Second, we are bringing folks together to identify the knowledge gaps that must be filled to evaluate socioeconomic and ecological impacts and trade-offs of different salinity management tools and strategies. And lastly, all of this is working towards an broader overarching goal of laying the groundwork for a collaborative adaptive management approach to salinity management. Next slide. So yesterday we had a series of great presentations, as well as lots of time in breakout groups to hear from all of you. So wanted to thank and acknowledge Deanna Sereno from the Contra Costa Water District for a really excellent keynote presentation that gave us the broad brushstroke and long history of salinity management in the Delta. We had a first breakout group focused on building conceptual models of salinity management actions, their trade-offs and key uncertainties. Then those same groups reconvened to create actor maps that visually depicted the key groups and individuals impacted and impacting salinity management. And then as great preparation for our work today, we had a closing presentation from Laura Larson from UC Berkeley that looked at the state of salinity modeling in the Delta, dove in more to some of the back-end details that inform the work that we're going to be hearing about and discussing today. Next slide. And so today, just momentarily, I'll be handing it over to John DeGeorge from RMA and Eli Atelovich and Lily Tomkovic from DWR, who will be talking about some novel salinity modeling work that they currently have in process. And so this is a great opportunity for those of you attending to help learn about the effort as it's underway and give some degree of feedback on either some new aspects that could be incorporated into what's currently being done, or helping to scope future efforts that could be done under the same modeling framework. In order to do this, following their presentation, we'll be moving you all into breakout groups. So you'll be randomly assigned into breakout groups to provide feedback on important metrics and visualizations of the modeling results, as well as further discussion of the trade-offs and concerns now that we actually have some concrete results in front of us. We'll hear some report outs from those groups, take a quick lunch break, and then we'll come back together to hear a presentation on co-design and modeling from Brett Milligan at UC Davis. Brett will also be talking with us a bit about the Just Transitions project, which is helping tackle some of the gaps in the social science research around salinity management in the system, a separate effort, but very related to the themes that we're talking about today. We'll have a brief wrap up, and then what we've done is we've taken all of the different feedback that we got from participants across our mural boards over these 2 days, and we've combined it into a single mural board that you will all have some open time to explore, add further notes and reflections based on what other groups have discussed. We'll also leave those open for you after and circulate them with folks who weren't able to attend. So really want to make sure that these provide the opportunity for folks to give detailed feedback. Next slide. Before we jump into the modeling results, I also wanted to just highlight some of the links between the work that we're talking about today and Delta Adapts, which is the Delta Stewardship Council's climate change strategy. So Delta Adapts, the first stage of Delta Adapts, the vulnerability assessment, was completed back in the summer of 2021. This brought together the best available science on a number of stressors, climate change stressors impacting the Delta. And this sets the stage, next slide, for the second phase, which is the adaptation plan. So the adaptation plan is developing since 2021, and this actually looks at concrete strategies that may be used to help folks in the Delta cope with the effects of climate change. So that report, there'll be a draft for public review that's released in mid to late April. We encourage you all to keep an eye out on the council listserv for more information about that. That'll be a great opportunity to weigh in about some of this back end of the adaptation plan. We do really want to hear from you on this. And then the current plan is to finish the adaptation plan by the summer of 2024. And so the modeling work that you're seeing presented today, currently in process, it won't be directly a part of the adaptation plan. However, it does address a number of the different suggestions and scenarios that are included in Delta Adapt. So it's a great extension of this work and allows us to really dive in to more of the details that are laid out at a higher level in the adaptation plan. So we're very excited about that work moving forward. Next slide. So to set the stage at a very high level before our next presentation, I just wanted to note that the work that you're seeing today that's being presented by the modeling team really came out of feedback that we heard directly from participants in workshop 1. What we heard there was that there was a real need to better understand, for better modeling tools, rather, to understand possible outcomes and management options. There wasn't enough flexibility in the models as they were currently working to adequately address the impacts of both restoration and sea level rise. And so these really floated to the top from feedback as scenarios that folks wanted to see modeled. This was our motivation for supporting this novel modeling work. Next slide. And what these key modeling developments allow us to do, which you'll hear about in much more detail shortly, is expand the modeling framework to include this wider range of scenarios, critically do the arduous work of really validating these new approaches, making sure they're working as expected and intended, as well as specifically modeling change to the system under Delta Adapt's restoration scenarios. So there's that linkage between the two projects. As well as provide the opportunity to do some sea level rise modeling that's consistent with both Delta Adapt and Ocean Protection Council guidance on the topic. And with that, I believe we can transition over our screen share. So we thank you all for this, for attending today, and we will have plenty of time for questions as part of this presentation. So I'll hand it over to John DeGeorge to get us started.
All right, thank you, Dylan. First, a check. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. And it's my pleasure to be a part of this team where RMA is collaborating with DWR on a really interesting project for the Delta Stewardship Council. So I'll be giving this presentation together with Eli and Lily from the Delta modeling section. And let me kind of get going here. So as Laurel pointed out yesterday, there's been a long history of doing very detailed modeling in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and the San Francisco estuary as a whole. But most management decision making is really tied to operational models that have to look over very long time periods. And particularly for these high resolution multidimensional models, it's very expensive to set them up and run them for long periods. It takes a lot of computation time, which either translates to waiting a long time for results or paying an awful lot of money in the cloud for multiple runs to be made. And the feedback between operations decisions and the behavior of the delta needs to be done at a very fine interval within the operational models themselves. So the primary objective of our project is to find a way to develop and test fast surrogate models for use within CalSim that can do a better job of representing the relationship of salinity to hydrology and operations under a wide variety of future alternatives that include very significant proposed geometry changes in the delta and sea level rise. And that requires this kind of set of steps, which I've got outlined here on the right side of the screen. We define these future scenarios and then simulate them with high resolution multidimensional models, and then take those results to train a surrogate. And we're focusing on artificial neural networks, which Eli will talk about quite a bit later in this presentation. We train the surrogate, show that it is working well enough based on the training, and then actually run it in CalSim for the periods of interest. And in this project, we're focusing on extended drought periods. And then there's a round trip process where you want to vet that the surrogate actually worked, meaning that it represented the salinity relationships correctly to CalSim. And the way we check that is by taking the CalSim output and then rerunning the multidimensional models for key periods and being sure that the appropriate relationships are met, and largely tested by whether or not the CalSim output respects the operating criteria that it's been provided. So that's a really quick overview. We are okay, that's not working. We are in the midst of this work, and our presentation today, I want to follow up on Laurel's presentation yesterday and go a little bit detail into the causes of salinity intrusion. And I think that's worthwhile because it may help you understand a little more deeply what we're trying to accomplish in training these surrogates and why they're so important. And then Eli and Lily will talk about the salinity impact versus operational response, talk about the surrogate construction and the data sets that we're using to generate the training. And then I'll pick up the conversation again as we talk about the initial modeling scenarios and looking at some example results. So getting started, if for folks that have been around the Delta, you know that it's a very well monitored a system. There are many locations where there's gauges delivering time series at a short interval that look at stage, flow, electrical conductivity as a surrogate for salinity. And this is pretty readily available. Any of you could go online to CDEC or other sources and download this data. And generally you get the short time scale data as shown in the top of these three plots, the 15-minute data, and you see the tidal timescale and variations with the tides. It's usually very useful to also look at a longer timescale and create a tidal averaged. So in these plots, those are in the kind of the lower left, and you see some different behaviors in the wiggly lines. And we take this information, we treat it very carefully actually, and put a lot of effort into being sure that our high resolution models do a good job of representing that. And that's showed here in part by this statistical comparison of computed and observed. We have pretty high standards of trying to match these time series. But more importantly, we're trying to match certain aspects. We want to get at the tidal phase and amplitude, which you can measure here against the stage on the fine time scale, spring neap cycling with phases of the moon. You get filling and draining of the delta, and that creates a different, longer period time or oscillation in the elevations in the delta. You also see it in changes in salinity here with the spring neap cycle, where you get more salt and then less salt on this basically 2-week interval. You also see details of operations where Clifton Court turns on, opens its gates and closes its gates, and that's reflected through the delta. You see net flow changes where operations ramp from one period of time to another here, driving negative flows in the Old River corridor. And most important, I think, to our conversation is the rate of salinity intrusion. And again, building off of what Laurel said yesterday, there's a very sophisticated management process that tries to keep the level of salt in the delta at an acceptable level. And to do that, the net delta outflow and other in-delta operations are managed so that the slope of this line is such that at the end of the dry period, you haven't exceeded salinity regulations in the central delta or at the export and use locations. So this slope is very important, and this slope is related to the mixing processes that are affected by sea level rise and geometry change. So just real quickly, here's taking that point data and giving you a little animation of it. During a dry period, the lighter colored arrows are tidal arrows. This is plotting that daily short timescale data. The darker arrows are the net flows. So here in a very dry period, the net outflow moving downstream is very small, but the tidal flows are big. Even into the delta, there's significant tidal flows going up the San Joaquin ship channel and going up the Sacramento ship channel. And you see some tidal variation going all the way up the Sacramento River. As I drag this slider forward, we're going to higher flow conditions. And still, even though it's a much higher outflow, the tidal flows exceed the net flows in the western and into the central delta. The upper part becomes more riverine, and the San Joaquin becomes more riverine. So this is the balance that's going on through the seasons between wet and dry periods. Another way of looking at that is taking particles and dropping them into the channel. So here we dropped sets of particles in the ship channel, not too far from Edmonton, and down here near the confluence. And an interesting thing here is in the more confined channels, these particles stay together as they go back and forth. Whereas here at the confluence, the flow regime is more complicated, and you see this plume getting stretched out. This is mixing. And if we look at that another way, whoops, here I'm dropping particles all the way across those same locations. And I'm going to let these particles travel for one tidal day, so 2 tidal cycles of flood and ebb. Because we're dropping particles all the way across the channel, you see they're spreading out quite a bit more. And then as this reaches the end, it's going to start freezing the particles after 1 day of movement. And what we're seeing is now a really good view of tidal mixing. So something that was at one location here is now stirred quite a bit over this. That stirring is what helps to transport salt from the ocean into the delta. Whereas here in the ship channel area, even though it's more distributed than in the previous simulation, it's still relatively confined. So the interaction between channels and embayments will act to change the mixing. So as you do tidal marsh restoration, this is really important. Where tidal marsh restoration occurs and how it connects to the main channels can affect the spread. And just kind of at a base level, the wider the spread, the more mixing, the more tendency there is to drive salt into the system. So here's that fine picture Dylan showed a second ago with a little animation on it. This is now a simulation of salinity, and you can see that mixing occurring as on the flood tide, you get saltier water driven into Frank's track. And these plumes get into Frank's track and they begin to mix around. that tends to bring salt from the western part of the system into the central system and then keep it there because it distributes through Frank's tract. Here's one more view of the seasonal variation. So this is starting in January. And then if I take this slider, is that working? The slider's not working. I have to play it. If we let this move into April, May, June, and I'm going to try to stop it around September, October. Oops. No, sorry. There we go. This is towards the end of the dry period. You can see the saltier water has made it in, and this is about the limit. So that seasonal ramp that I showed you in one of the earlier slides is really trying to maintain this so that the central part of the delta is at an acceptable level of salinity for local use, and also the export corridors stay at an acceptable level of salinity for export into the aqueducts. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Eli, and he's going to talk about kind of looking at changes in the system with restoration and salinity, sea level rise.
Yeah, thanks, John. So hi, everybody. Also very happy to be here. And I'm just going to sort of pick up where John left off. Same sorts of processes, but I'm going to focus more on the kinds of change that we're envisioning in our project. So the first case I wanted to show off is dispersion between a main channel and an island via a breach. And the graphic here is an animation of salinity exchange at a hypothetical breach near Van Sickle Island. You can kind of just see from looking at the pictures how there's a kind of a mixing or stirring that's going on, but I wanted to show a couple of features. First of all, you can see if you look closely that the tides turn around faster on the island than they. Oh, can you just roll it one more time there, John? So you can go from halfway or something. The tides turn around a little bit on the shallow island than they do in the deeper channel, and that's because of inertia that occurs on the channel. And so you have a sort of an asynchronicity between the velocity in the two places. You also see a staggering of timing between the highest concentrations that are coming upstream on the Sacramento River there and the moment of greatest concentration that's going out into the island. And so as the animation comes to a rest the second time, what I think you will believe, I think this is the last one. No, one more time. You'll see that the salinity intrusion is a little bit greater on the case that has the island breach. This is, by the way, a pretty good generalization on a restoration case that has an island adjacent to the main channel like this on the main salinity intrusion pathway. You see, the orange and red hues have crept up a little bit. It's subtle. That's also typical. And then right at the point of the breach, you can see there's a little bit of a Rorschach test there. That's the mixing that's happening back and forth between the island and the channel. So this is yet another example of excursion. John already showed those particles that showed how they sort of move at different rates as there are subtle little differences in velocity along the channel that move them around differently. You also see it with packets of or tracers that are moved off into an island. They kind of shuffle off, mix around a little bit, and then come back onto the main stem. And every time you have a mixing process like that, in the presence of a place like the confluence zone that has a really steep gradient from seaward to landward, that's going to bring salinity intrusion into the delta. So it's kind of the combination of all these mixed up conveyor belts going at different speeds, plus the presence of a strong gradient. That combination is what gives you salinity intrusion. Okay, the next example is Frank's tract futures. Okay, and this is just a still, not an animation. On the left, we've got the existent shallow geometry of Frank's tract. And you can see the top picture is just the bathymetry. It's very flat. The bottom picture is that process that John already showed off. It's what we call a jet of saltier water shooting into Frank's tract. That happens every flood tide. Then it mixes around and goes back at a lower salinity. And that mixing process of saltier water shooting in and mixing happens relentlessly every tide cycle, and you can see that in the end, it's created area of saltier water on Western Franks Tract. So there's been a kind of a steady buildup. The case on the right is Franks Tract Futures. That's a restoration case that Brett Milligan's going to talk about a lot later. So you can see the geometry of that restoration in the top right slide where it says bed elevation, and that you have borrow areas that are in deep blue. You have crimson areas that represent fill areas, and then you can probably just barely make out that there are marsh channels incised into the fill areas. Then those are, so it's topographically a lot more complex, and that's one of the interesting things about the Franks Tract Futures restoration idea is, although it introduces that kind of topographical complexity, the main effect that it has on salinity intrusion is just to shut down the dispersion mechanism on the left. So it's a simplification in terms of, you know, regional salinity dynamics. Next slide, please. Okay, then the one other example that I wanted to bring up, just so that we have a few cases to talk about, is sea level rise. Now we've got a fairly different set of processes going on. Laura Larson introduced them a little bit in her talk yesterday, and I believe Deanna did as well. In the case of sea level rise, you've probably seen these sort of salt wedge pictures before, like the one on the bottom left. This picture shows fresher, lighter water in dark blue and denser water in red. And you can see that that fresher water is kind of riding out over the denser water. This can happen either on a tidally averaged basis, in which case it's often associated with the term gravitational circulation. It can also happen tide cycle by tide cycle, in which case it's sometimes associated with the words periodic stratification. But in either case, it generates what we call an exchange flow, where fresh water on the net is directed out of the estuary toward the surface, and saltier water is directed into the estuary near the bottom. And that, again, is something that you see accumulated over entire tide cycles. Now, the linkage to sea level rise is that those exchange flows scale very strongly with the depth of the water. And so as sea level rise progresses, if accretion on the beds doesn't keep pace, you get deeper water. And you can expect that these baroclinic, that's what we call density-driven mixing, these baroclinic processes can become increasingly important to delta mixing. We have a diagnostic for that. It's called the Richardson number, and it's shown over on the right-hand plot. So what you're looking at there, these are both modeling artifacts from the Bay Delta Schism sea level rise study. On the top panel, there's the Richardson number from the current sea level condition. And on the bottom panel, you can see the same stage of the tide. It's staggered a little bit in order to catch a maximum. And that is in a case with 5.2 feet of sea level rise. And what the Richardson number does is it assesses the tendency towards stratified flow in terms of the things that really drive it or limit it. So that includes fresh flow, the strength of the tides, because very strong tides tend to shake up the water column and cause salinity to break up. It includes the strength of the horizontal salinity gradient. So if there's a strong gradient present in the area, that helps stratification form. And then, of course, there's depth. And like we said, it's very strongly associated with depth. So you can see that in the sea level rise case, there's a much stronger dominance of this mechanism in contributing to mixing. Next, John. Okay, but it's not the only thing that's associated with mixing, and that's important. This is a completely different process that I've shown here on this slide, but it's also one that is changed by sea level. And what we're looking at here is a quantity. We're looking at the confluence of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and we're looking at a quantity called transport velocity. So that's a lot like mean flow, except that instead of being taken over an entire cross-section, it's a quantity that exists at a point. And if you look here at the area that I've circled in a solid black, which is the main stem of the Sacramento, you can see that the velocities are stronger in the no sea level rise case. There's more white there in the middle of the channel. and the contrast between the channel and the shoals are bigger. And that's because as the water level is down, the sort of the contrast between the shallow water and the deeper water is bigger, and you get stickier water in shallow water. Now, if we advance the slide one step towards where there's there should be a dashed line, and this is Broad Slough. It's an area that's more topological varied, and just because of the way the geometry lays out in this location, there's more red in, or there's a sort of more red coverage in Broad Slough in the case that does have sea level rise. So you get changes that are a little bit hard to anticipate. And the reason that this is important is that even though as sea level rise progresses, these vertical processes are going to start dominating the conversation, and they produce a lot of the big changes that we see in sea level rise scenarios. They sort of emanate more from the main channel. And the way that change is propagated regionally around all the embayments and shoals is via some of these other processes. And in fact, you can see sometimes in very, very incipient, like very low levels of sea level rise, you can see cases where the main channels get a little saltier, but just for a while, the shoals and side embayments actually get a little bit fresher. Okay. Now let's shift gears. Those are sort of the cases that we've got as prototypes. Now I wanted to shift gear towards the main subject of our project, which is to look and sort of balance these very fine scale hydrodynamic changes that we see in the multidimensional models with the larger system context of California water. And John has already alluded a little bit to this. Okay, so the coupling goes two directions. When we initially look at a project or investigate sea level rise, the way that we usually do it is a really simple A/B experiment where we hold all the inflows and the tidal conditions constant, and then we drop in the change. In this case, the bottom right, you can see Frank's track futures. That's the stand-in example for this slide. And doing that A/B experiment, just dropping in the change in exactly the same flow inputs is a good and fairly disciplined way to investigate what changes you might see. But it doesn't produce the bottom line response that you would probably see in the field. And the reason for this is that the new scenario is going to change the flow salinity response of the delta. Depending on how the changes manifest, just in the particular places where there are seasonal water quality standards, the operators are going to rearrange the way they do business. They're going to see new opportunities. They may certain objectives may be easier to comply with, certain may become more difficult, and they'll adjust around those. And the bottom line result that you might see may come through as a salinity bet. So after they've done that adjustment, so I've kind of made the transition over to the state scale. They adjust reservoir operations around the newly changed delta, and the bottom line result that comes back all the way back, the pendulum swings to the delta. It might be the same as the original salinity response that you saw, but it may take the form of extra cold water storage in the reservoirs or extended resilience to drought. Next slide, please. Okay. Another way of talking about operational response is to think of any change that's made to the physical delta as being something that you can look at from two bracketing perspectives. And I think you've already seen these slides a couple times this workshop, so apologize for that. But what we're looking at here are both of these plots come from a study of sea level rise in the delta. And they're both focused on the Edmonton D1641 compliance station, which is about 10 to 15 kilometers up from the Sacramento-San Joaquin confluence. On the left-hand plot, what you're looking at is the salinity impact view, which is what happens when you hold flows constant and you just introduce new sea level rise. And in that scenario, you can see the sea level increments are on the bottom axis. So these are the tick marks are the levels that we looked at. The left axis is salinity, or actually it's in units of conductance, microsiemens per centimeter. That is a unit that's first of all, it's the unit that salinity is actually, it's the quantity that's actually measured when we talk about salinity in the delta part of the domain, and it's also the unit that the Edmonton standard is expressed in. And what you see is that as sea level rise progresses, the salinity, the average salinity in August for that compliance station goes up. And there's an inflection that happens around 3 feet where it steepens. So things get, the steepening gets steeper. I put in kind of a light gray, a region that includes salinities that we have seen at our very saltiest historically, although not usually in the month of August. And then the darker examples at the very top, or the single example is these are levels of salinity which we have no historical examples. So things do get pretty salty. On the right, we have a completely different view, which is the water cost. And this is, in this case, what we do is we apply enough outflow, and this comes from a combination of reduced exports and increased Sacramento inflows, in order to resist that added salinity intrusion. So at Edmonton, you won't see an impact under this case, at least not during compliance season. And the amount of water, so we've still got, so now in the bottom axis, we've got the amount of water that is needed in order to resist the change in the status quo salinity at Edmonton. And you've got the increments of sea level rise on the left axis. And as you can see, I think Laura pointed this out, and so did Deanna also in earlier days, yesterday, that the amount of water that you need increases kind of exponentially. Okay, next slide, please. All right, getting close to my last slide here. So this is my last slide, in fact. So I'm just going to tell the same story, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of the moving parts of our project. Okay, so you've heard a little bit about ANNs. John said I was going to talk a lot about them. I think Lily mention structure a little bit. We're certainly available for questions on deeper architectural questions. But the ANN is an empirical model that is a good emulator of the results, key results of a more complicated model. So it's in the operations literature, it's called a surrogate, and we have it in there, and it is able to learn the most important relationships that are embedded in the higher dimensional model output and represent them. So that will reside alongside the operations model. And in fact, to make that coupling more transparent, we've created a new open source library called Cal Surrogate that is, anybody who wants to be a super early and tolerant user can contact me, but it will be released with the products of this project as a way of coupling ANNs to operations models. And as the operations model will chug along, usually at a coarser time step, the monthly in the case of calcium, and it will ask the ANN, hey, what are the compliant combinations of inflows and exports? And it uses that as a system constraint as it's operating the California system. At that point, the detailed models are offline, but they come into play in two ways. The first is we need the detailed model data for training, and Lily's going to follow immediately after me and talk a lot about how we make that tractable and accurate. Then after the calcium model completes, we also will only at that point have a kind of simple compliance-oriented set of outputs to describe the delta. So we have to feed the flows that come out of calcium back into the detailed models in order to get a richer spatial response in the delta. We also have to do it, as John mentioned, just to validate that the surrogate worked. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lily to take the story a step further.
Thank you, Eli. So just to reiterate what Eli was saying, slightly different voice. So that large operational model of calcium is relying on the ANN, which is emulating the expected behavior of the delta in response to operational changes using that detailed model. So in order for that to be successful, we need the model inputs and outputs for the detailed models to capture a bit of variability in the delta, as well as a bit of variability that we expect in the future in these different scenarios. And since we're using,
sorry, went too fast.
And also, we know that those multidimensional models are really computationally expensive, and they take a lot of time to produce a more detailed result. So with these, sea level rise scenarios and multiple large scale restoration scenarios, it could be over 180 years of simulations if we use the traditional training history of inputs. So we want to condense the variability and information contained in those historical years into fewer representative years, so that we can use those complex models to train the ANN how the delta responds to operational changes given large scale restoration and sea level rise. Okay, next slide is good. So I'm going to briefly talk about a grouping technique that we use to on the historical inputs into the model to condense the variability that we're training the machine learning tool with. So here is a schematic. It's a simplified schematic. And what we use is called k-means clustering. So you can see the data on the left. If you imagine on the x-axis might be something like inflow to the delta, and on the y-axis might be something like exports. It's not, it's just a simplified schematic. But, but if it were, we might want to say, how does this data kind of sort itself out? And so you can use this technique called k-means clustering. It uses statistical methods to then clump the data into separate groups. So you can see that they're distinct from each other. There is a star kind of in the middle of each one showing what the mean characteristics of each group are, so that they are unique from each other, but they also gather the full variability of the input data. So yeah, if we can go to the next slide. So this looks like a mess, and that's fair. It is 30 years of delta exports on the top panel. And on the bottom panel is northern flow, with Sacramento River being the main contributor. And time starts in December on the left and ends in November on the right. And each year is its own line. When we do the clustering, we're most interested in training the model to handle salinity responses, and management scenarios. So we're doing the clustering analysis from June, which is about halfway through the plot, over to the right through the end of November. So we can go to the next slide. So if that first slide that I showed with the kind of two XY plots where you have the clustering results are different from each other, this is called a clustergram. So we take the input data of the inflows and the exports and then test out different numbers of clusters. And what we want is the clusters to be different enough from each other, but also capture the full variability of the input data. So you can see that for 4, we get nice separation between those clusters in their PCA weighted means. And I won't go into what that means, but it's kind of the difference, the main difference between each of those clusters and a different dimensionality. But if you go over to 5, you see that there's 2 clusters that are pretty close together, and you don't get as much information out of adding another cluster. So we can go to the next slide. And so this is how we use those k-means clusters to turn this into 4 distinct clusters. So this first one is kind of a moderately wet year, with that thick line from June to the end of November being the mean of those clusters. And that's how we determined what our representative water year would be. So this is our moderate to wet year. This is our, go ahead. Yeah, that's our very wet year. And then this is a moderate dry year. And then the last one being our drought year. With 2014 and 15 being clustered together, as you would expect, right? And if you go to the last slide, we can see how those 4 representative water years, 2008, 10, 12, and 14, look against the landscape of all of the historical inputs into the delta. And then we use these 4 representative water years as skeletons to kind of drape additional variability in things like the gate operations at Sassoon Marsh, as well as the Delta Cross Channel, and then also kind of playing with the tidal inputs so that when the ANN is learning, the ANN is the machine learning tool, when it's learning all those inputs and outputs from the multidimensional model, it can capture any of the variability that calcium might run into, so that it's operating within a well-trained data set. So we use these 4 years, and we could go to the next slide. And we add variations in inflow, we add variations in exports, we add variations in the consumptive use within the delta itself, as well as the gate operations. And this is one of the ways that we did that, was we kind of added these pulses, which then get attenuated. So the panels 2 through 4, the attenuated pulse, the random shifts, and the stochastic cycles all get added together and then draped on top of the original data set at the bottom to produce this perturbed final data set. And then we tested that to make sure that we're kind of covering all of the variability in the delta as far as those input variables go. And then that gives us a more robust tool when we put that back into the machine learning tool, the ANN, which CalSim uses to make some operational decisions. So I'll be in one of the great breakout groups if you have more questions about that. But and then the next slide, I just kind of wanted to, reiterate where that kind of all ties back together is the operational model is only looking at the ANN, which is representative of the detailed models, but we want those detailed models to be robust inputs and outputs for the ANN to be well trained. And I'll pass it to you, John.
All right. Thank you, Lily. And again, I think while that is a pretty detailed discussion, it's a really critical aspect of what we're trying to accomplish, because when the original ANNs were trained for CalSim, they were working with DSM2, a one-dimensional model. It's really quite quick. It's very reasonable to be able to run that for 100 years of simulation, but it only represents the current condition in the delta. And to accommodate these new changes, we need the higher dimensional models, which take much, much more time to run. So that clustering that Lily was talking about was really critical to being able to pull this off and have adequate training. So I'm going to pick this up and talk a little bit about the restoration scenario simulations that are underway, and both how these are used to provide training data to the ANN process, ANN surrogate creation process, and then also to provide change metrics that may be useful in a wider context with our round trip modeling. So we developed a base case that includes most of the current restoration activities that are either been completed or are well underway to set up a basis of comparison. And then we're looking currently at a Sassoon Marsh-based restoration case that has a relatively simple change in breaching levees into the Grizzly Island, and also includes Chips Island. And then we're looking at another section in Cache Slough that includes Lookout Slough, Prospect Island, and Little Egbert. Both of these are inspired by Delta Adapts. That's not a complete representation of Delta Adapts, but we're trying to do as best we can under our current timing to get this work accomplished. We'll also be looking later at a combination of these and a few other scenarios, which I'll mention later. Here's just a quick animation from the schism modeling. So we're dropping sets of particles at 4 locations, color-coded in black, red, green, and blue. And we've got the base condition here on the left, and we have the Sassoon Marsh restoration condition here on the right. So pretty obviously, you see a lot of the red particles going into the restoration area, but maybe more interesting, we get a change in the distribution of blue particles and green particles down in the lower part. So the green particles in the current condition are up in Montezuma Slough, whereas in the restoration condition, they're actually moving out into the confluence. It's changed a bit on the Grizzly Bay area, and the black, in this case, the black particles from this drop actually just migrate all over into the eastern part of Grizzly Bay. So that's interesting. It's helpful to see the particle motions, but really we need to look at this at kind of a larger scale. And the RMA team working with the Delta Stewardship Council developed a set of metrics from a previous study that are very interesting to look at. And I'm going to pick just a few of these, including tidal range and tidal prism, and a first shot at salinity to let you see a bit of the effect on the current simulations. So looking at tidal range, as I mentioned earlier, we get stage information all over the delta currently, and we can line that up from our base condition simulation at particular locations and look at the alternative. And typically when you add tidal prism, when you breach areas and open new areas to tidal inundation, it has a tendency to reduce tidal range in that region, and kind of a surprisingly large region near that restoration. So with the models, we can take this data everywhere and create a color contour map from it. So we have a base condition tidal range and an alternative condition tidal range, and then subtract these values one from another and get a change metric. This result happens to be from our previous study, but here's an example from our current study. So here's the change in tidal range with the Sassoon restoration suite. And note that this changes in feet, and so it goes from half a foot less to half a foot more. And the part where it disappears into white is actually quite small. It's like 5/100ths of a foot. So that this is stretching this out quite a ways, but it does show you how far that impact goes. There's very significant reduction in tidal range right near the breaches on Montezuma Slough. There's also tidal range reduction throughout throughout Sassoon Bay and towards the confluence. And that tidal range actually reduces all the way up a little bit into the Liberty Island area and into the Central Delta. For the Cache suite, there's a strong impact right in Cache Slough, and it moves down the ship channel, but it doesn't really make it out into Sassoon Bay. So this is limited more into the Delta itself and not really touching Sassoon Bay. Another interesting metric is tidal prism, and this is a notion of how much water moves along a channel. So every location in the model, we can calculate a cross-sectional flood tide volume. So the flood tide volume is reset at the start of flood tide, and then it accumulates through the tide. So in the base case, in the base case, this is typically going to be lower than the alternative case as water is moving up and filling those newly flooded areas. So in this case, this is on the way towards restoration, and the base case comes up, and you see it will vary from day to day depending on the tides, but the amount of water moving up towards the flooded area is quite a bit higher. In other areas, this may be less. And so here we're plotting this again as a color contour, and you see for the Sassoon suite configuration, there's an increase in tidal prism moving up through the western end of Sassoon Bay and into Montezuma Slough, but it does reduce the tidal prism, the volume of water moving upstream into the ship channel. So this is an important difference from the Liberty case, where the Liberty case, it pulls more water up from the ship channel into these newly restored areas, and that Liberty Island itself is shaded out because that color contour is not being created in this map. So there is a change in Liberty Island itself, it's just not shown. But here, there's an increase here, but there's in fact a decrease going up into past Carquinez into Sassoon Bay. And that has to do with a variety of factors of how this newly flooded area changes the motion of the wave that moves into the Delta, bringing the flood tide in and kind of acting to dampen or change the timing. So that actually has an impact very far away from the restoration area itself. Being kind of like really into weird hydrodynamic effects, it was really surprising when we first started seeing this, the scale of the interactions of restorations, something way up in Cache could affect the tides all the way down to Carquinez. So here's some kind of fresh off the presses results looking at salinity. Yesterday, Deanna showed a simulation result that the RMA team developed quite a while ago, looking at variations of restorations in the Sassoon Marsh area. And those had a pretty obvious impact of reduction in salinity kind of into the central delta. Here, it's not really showing up in the same way, and we're in the process of figuring that out, but that may have something to do with Chips Island being added in here. But these are hot off the presses. What we do see is an increase in salinity moving over into the western part of Grizzly Bay, and an increase in salinity moving up into the Montezuma Slough and Sassoon Marsh itself. And so here's a difference plot for that area. And again, there's an increase, and here this is a fractional change in electrical conductivity. So you can read this would be the white area is less than a 5% change, and the dark blue and dark red are greater than 50%. So there's a significant increase in the eastern side of Montezuma Slough, increases up into Sassoon Marsh. It's fairly even as it goes into the confluence, and there's a little bit of a decrease showing up in some of our simulation, or this is from the RMA simulation, as you get towards Edmonton. So this is just the beginning of the story. There should be a lot more to this story coming over the next weeks and months as we finish this out. So again, when we do our round trip evaluation, we will be able to provide those metrics and potentially other metrics of interest. And I think that's one of the topics that we'd really like to get some input from the folks in this workshop through our discussion sessions. So just in summary, where we are to date, we have selected our primary scenarios for simulation. That includes the cache suite, the Sassoon suite, a combination of these inspired by Delta Adapts. We also want to look at the Frank-Strack futures and a sea level rise, which we're aiming at 3.5 feet currently. Eli has pretty much completed the work needed to be done to set up the training methodology. The code development is ready, and we are now ready to take the training data. And Lily has completed the clustering analysis, and we now have the training data sets we need to work from. So we're in the process of running these simulations currently. And the upcoming work will be to perform that training, verify that, and then to do some representative CalSim runs where we can check the round trip. And with that, Dylan, we're open it to questions.
Great. So we'll take just a little under 20 minutes for questions. You should see a note in the chat from Stephen. A reminder, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A. And I will go ahead and read our first question in the Q&A and open it up to our presenters. So tidal marsh restoration was mentioned in the presentation to have an effect on salinity intrusion. How could the ANN surrogate work be integrated with planning of tidal marsh restoration or generally non-flow salinity management actions? Would the ANN be retrained every time there is a significant restoration work? Thank you. Okay, so some good questions there. In work to date, there is some indication that superposition may be useful within limits. If you do an analysis for a cache suite and we do the analysis for the Sassoon suite, it could be that we can find that the combination of those may be very well represented by the summation of those two changes. That's yet to be fully determined. I know that when you do very large scale simulation, the response becomes pretty nonlinear. And then, yeah, you have to develop a new training set for each scenario. And what we're hoping to do through this process is to streamline that ability so that you can do a relatively constrained number of simulations with the high dimensional models that capture the details of those flows, and then quickly come up with an alternate surrogate that could then be used in CalSim.
Yeah, if I can add to that, the machine learning literature is rich with techniques that extend knowledge, in an economical way. So you've got your ANN that can speak French and you teach it Portuguese or something like that. As long as the constructs are good on the original effort, there are ways to sort of transfer over some of that learning and do it even more economically.
Dylan, I think we got to all aspects of that question. If we missed something, let me know.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those answers. So we'll just be reading out these questions in the order we receive them. And so this is a question for Lily. What is the purpose of the stochastic cycles being added in slide 31? What is the period of the signal? And is there a physical process this is a proxy for?
John, do you want to go back to that slide real quick so that we have, for context for other people in case they didn't remember our slide numbers by heart? So this is talking about, oh, excuse me. This is talking about adding variation to the existing years of inputs in order to capture variation of, or capture the full variation of inputs into the delta. The stochastic cycles kind of speak to the way that the ANN is trained. It uses both the current time step and it also uses lag data. And so this kind of allows for that to be a little bit more robust. So that is not just kind of flatline data. It's using not only the current time step, but the last time step was a little bit different than it normally is used to. And so that the ANN isn't just memorizing a water year and just regurgitating what that water year would look like. It's actually like memorizing how the model would respond to those scenarios. Eli, do you want to add anything to that? Is that?
No, that's right. I mean, the idea is to exercise different parts of the lag structure differently. The lags themselves are constructed from fortnightly or sort of 14, 15-day cycles, 30-day and 60s. So they're aligned with seasonality, and they are all periods that fall within the lag structure of the ANN itself. So and I think as maybe a counterexample, you could think about the current way that ANNs are trained on 100 years of data. When they are perturbed, if they are perturbed, it's like the whole input, like all of Sacramento flow is bumped up by 10%. And that's in terms of the many lags, if you're looking at a 118-day history, the different parts of the lag are all being bumped up by the same amount. So you have what should be a kind of rich time history that is effectively very multidimensional, but it's all being pushed in a one-dimensional direction. And what we're trying to do is mix it up a little bit and throw some differences in. And as Lily said, like also confuse it a little bit as far as memorization is concerned. It can't just say, oh, I remember that wiggle. That's from when Jones Track blew up. And, it's not supposed to know about Jones Track. So we want to fail on Jones Track. So we don't want to just memorize a wiggle that happened on the day that Jones Track happened to have flooded.
Great. So next question up, and this is two. So these two sort of go together. So I'll read them back to back. So it looks like in the Sassoon Suite model would actually increase salinity intrusion in the Sassoon Marsh, but might reduce salinity into the delta ? And that person's asking if they're understanding that right. And then a follow-up question on that was, how was the unrealistic Sassoon Marsh tidal restoration scenario selected?
So that first comment, that is absolutely correct. By reaching areas into the, in fact, maybe I can just go back to that slide. By reaching areas into Grizzly Island, and I think if anywhere in Sassoon Marsh, that would tend to pull more salt water up into that area, because the tidal prism that's feeding that is coming from the west. It's coming up from the western part of Sassoon Bay and Carquinez Straits. And we do see in many simulations a little reduction, in some cases a lot of reduction of salt coming up past the confluence area. In this particular case, it was less than we've seen in others, and that's why kind of we're in the QA process now. But that is a reasonable observation, and there are trade-offs. So if you're interested in salinity in some area, that you might improve salinity in one area and not in another, and that's true across restorations kind of wherever they go in the delta. With regard to the configuration, we'll have a more complete description of that in our report. The delta adapts did not have a significant design component to it as to exactly how their restorations would be done. So this is leaving most of the existing topography of Grizzly Island alone and just breaching and giving it access so we can get at least some flooding throughout Grizzly Island. I think the overall tidal range in Grizzly Island was not very much, so there is a lot of constriction of the conveyance due to the existing topography.
And I just wanted to add, and maybe also John, you can veto this if you'd like, but what we're trying to do is test a retraining of a tool, and this really allows us to flex how effective that training is. So doing a large scale restoration like this, whether or not it's very feasible or whether or not we would want to actually use it, is not as relevant as how much does it change the system and how much can we then train the tool to anticipate those changes.
Yeah, thank you, Lily. That is a super important point. And I know that's very challenging in conversations like this with a wide group of people, because we really are considering ourselves tool makers at this process, and we're not trying to do a complete actual restoration analysis that people would take out into planning. We want to help provide this tool that can then be brought forward and used in more detailed scenarios later. And I think there was a question related to that.
Yeah, but I can't
Yeah.
resist though. Just sort of about that last comment about the realism. There is. I hope that participants in the workshop will sort of take to heart the role of uncertainty as sea level rise progresses in particular. So when I looked at this scenario, one of my first reactions was that if you're going to put breaches on Montezuma only, and you're looking at these sort of weather-worn levees on the southern perimeter of Sassoon, that this restoration isn't just breaches on Montezuma. It's the Great Wall of Sassoon on the south side, right? And it may be that we don't have the resources to make something like that happen long term. So I think that as we come up with these designs and we talk about quote adapting, let's think about limited resources and the fact that maybe how the Delta evolves is going to be a combination of, I'm sorry to say it, but dilapidation and deliberate, informed landscape change. It's something that I think is a little bit of a missing ingredient from this process.
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah.
Great. I want to try to get a few more questions in because we do have some good ones coming in, but if we're not able to quite cover them all, just want to highlight that these can be brought back up in the in your breakout groups following our quick break. So just again, sort of in order received, question here is, will any of the CalSim runs include inputs of meeting current water quality standards over a multi-year drought? And then I'll actually combine this one as well with a related question from a little bit later, but this is regulations such as D1641, biological opinions, et cetera, can change the delta flow and export regimes. For the cluster analysis, shall data before these regulations be excluded? Old data might not be useful to inform future operations.
Yeah. Eli, can you take that?
Yeah, so absolutely. And this is a big difference between training based on CalSim output. So there is kind of a long-term recirculation where CalSim puts out output, and then that's kind of used as input for further ANNs. No, I don't think that point is justified. One of the issues with current ANNs is that they are trained in a very narrow groove that's formed around current regulations, and I believe, based on what I've seen so far, that valley can be widened, and that we can talk about regulations. Now, it's absolutely true that some of the older operating regimes may not be as important, but if the tool generalizes so poorly that it can't handle some of those past regimes, I think that that would be a little bit of a red flag with me. I mean, it may turn out to be the case, but I would prefer to have a tool that generalizes, to include most of what we've seen, at least in the past 35 years.
And then also just wanted to make sure that the initial question about calcium, including inputs of meeting current water quality standards over a
I think in
multi-year
a sense
drought.
that's the base condition for all of our studies, right? Like that is largely what we'll be comparing to. And one sort of addendum to the whole technique that Lily pointed out is that I think one of the sort of logical disconnects here is that you have to train data on exactly the same data that will be the ultimate application. In fact, if you're getting ready to go on a rafting trip or something like that, you might go to the gym and work really hard and intensively, in order to get strong enough to go to the gym. So the training set has to be wise, both from the point of view of being realistic in terms of delta actions, but you do want to do a little extra strength training there, but absolutely one of the main scenarios that we have to be able to be faithful to is just everyday operations under the current regulatory regime, and we're very aware of that.
If I could just say that, and just I'm pretty much saying what Eli said with a little bit different twist. The key thing about what we're doing here is to train these alternate surrogate models so that calcium can work realistically against the behavior of the delta. We aren't constraining that the surrogate should be able to work with very different calcium assumptions. It's just trying to represent what happens in the delta itself. So in our initial testing, we're going to try to be sure that we can give calcium the information that it needs to meet the criteria that it's trying to meet. But by doing that, we're setting it up so that surrogate could be used in a much wider range of calcium simulations as future projects go forward.
Yeah. And John Herrick just made an excellent point that's sort of associated with that, John, which is that really the transition to the loss of the delta is something that is really not covered in D1641 exactly. There is a sort of a gray area there where a lot of the time operators apply for temporary urgent change. They make temporary urgent change petitions, and there's some relaxations that occur. So there is a bit of a wobble there as we approach what I label end year drought, like the final year drought. Generally, we're trying to kind of push things and extend them a little bit.
Okay, we're a couple minutes behind, but I did just want to squeeze in a quick answer to a final question here, which is when does this phase of the work wrap up, and what excites you most about potential future use cases for this approach in 2 minutes or less?
Okay, the easy answer is it wraps up at the end of 2024. So we still have a few more months to get our part of it done. And then the part that excites me the most is that we can now, with the results of this process, have a way of really representing large-scale integrated changes with the system, considering both geometry and sea level rise, that we can feed back into calcium. And I think because a lot of the conversation occurs through calcium simulations and not many highly detailed simulations of using the mechanistic models of the delta. So I think that's really exciting. Go ahead, Eli.
No, I was saying, I mean, once you've got the tool, you can get into more of this kind of co-design process where you're able to model things that the ideas that everybody's got, right? It's a way, it makes the model sort of more available while we're in this honing stage. It's harder to explore, everybody's ideas, but it is a great tool for having a conversation about the delta.
Great, and in the interest, I think of the fact that we do still have a few questions left that will probably be relevant for working in our breakout groups. I think we'll adjust our time just slightly here so that we can answer a few more of these questions in the big group to help us set up for the next round here. So one of these questions is, how is the 3.5 feet of sea level rise related to sea level at the Golden Gate?
It's essentially it's essentially at the Golden Gate. I mean, it's the boundary condition for Bay Delta Schism is a little bit offshore. It's an arc around the Farallon Islands, and that's where we do the sea level rise increment. It's usually very similar at the Golden Gate, the amount of increment. By the time you get to a place called Martinez, there's usually, you know, discernible but small changes in tidal characteristics in other ways.
Great. We have a question specifically about Frank's Tract. So in Frank's Tract, how has the recent expansion and prevalence of aquatic vegetation affected or would affect the flow pattern and salinity distribution? Questioner notes that it's a speculative question.
Yeah, no, we've done a lot of work on that. We've done it mostly around you know, the current condition, right, which is the current geometry, and you do see evolution in vegetation patterns. You know, right where that yellow jet is, there used to be a feature in the vegetation structure called the rib, which was an open area that sort of had higher velocity water rushing through Frank's Tract. And during the period where the rib is in place, you get faster equalization of the tract with water on the outside. Nowadays, the vegetation is more variable to year. Even the community structure is different year to year, and it's more occluded over a larger area. We are still getting our models. We do have a paper out on incorporating vegetation into the model, and Frank's Tract was the centerpiece of that article, of the methods paper. We're still learning, like for instance, last year we did a cooperative project with the USGS to measure a quantity called water age, which is it's based on isotope measurements, but it kind of can measure how long it's been since water was in another place, like the San Joaquin River. So it measures how long it takes flushing water from the San Joaquin to get onto Frank's Tract, and we're kind of matching up with that. But we do see changes year to year. We see a change in that when the emergency drought barrier goes in. It's definitely a factor. It is, again, simplified under the Frank's Tract Future proposal, right? That the borrow areas will be deeper and not subject as much to vegetation. The other areas will, you know, certainly vegetation affects the success of restoration projects, but that would be a different dynamic, and it would matter less to the salinity intrusion process.
Great. So just one from earlier that I think was partially, but maybe not completely answered, is about how the spatial variation within Grizzly and Liberty sites was included in the simulation. Or could you add spatial or elevational heterogeneity in the restored islands, and how would that affect overall salinity fluxes?
So in developing these geometries, we used our best available grid sets for these restorations. So the RMA team has done independent simulation of most of these areas for other purposes, and we took the best available kind of common assumption geometries to use. We shared those with Lily, and Lily shared some of her geometries with us to come up with what we implemented for these simulations. Now, having said that, these models are extraordinarily flexible, and they could be, alternate geometries could be proposed and tested with the detailed models. And then if one of those, well, particularly the breach locations and conveyance kind of through that region near the breach, has a lot to do with how much tidal prism gets into a flooded area. That can have a lot of effects on its regional impact, and may be very well worth simulating an alternate geometry with the models and then going through this surrogate training process to pitch it back out so it could be used in CalSim. Lily, I don't know, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that covers what's going on there.
You want to pitch the restoration library idea a little bit?
That's a good idea, yeah. So one of the things as modelers that we run into every time we're looking at a different restoration site is what else has been done in the area and how do we get access to that information. And so
in all of these different restoration designs, there is many of them are publicly available, but that has a hard asterisk there because it's available if you can work hard enough to find them. And so what we're working on is developing a restoration assets library that basically puts all those different topologies and design documents in a singular place where people can use them on different projects. So if you're doing a restoration site nearby an existing one, you can incorporate that existing geometry and design features into your model. And we used a bit of that work that we already did on the restoration assets library. We used to develop the geometries and the topologies of this project.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for your questions. We're adjusting some of our time, but we do need to cut it there. So I think we have one or two lingering questions, and we do encourage you to bring those up in our breakout groups. So we can virtual round of applause for our presenters. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you. We can bring back up this slide for our break. So we'll take 10 minutes. We're gonna do a little bit of work to get our breakout group set up. You all can grab a snack or whatever you need. Because for this activity, we're going to be dividing up participants randomly. Please log off if you don't plan to participate in the breakout group so we know who's actually here and we can sort you accordingly. You can come back on later in the day for our report out. So
Right.
I'll include some more of that information. So thanks all, and we'll see you back here in just a few minutes.
Thanks.
of this later I'll remind us of this later as well, but do just want to note that all of the information that you're sharing with us today, both verbally, which we're capturing through our note takers, as well as on the mural boards themselves directly, this is all going to be synthesized as part of a larger summary of these 2 salinity management workshops and what we heard from you all. So, even if some suggestions or thoughts are out of scope, for example, of the modeling directly, we do, really acknowledge that it's important for us to be thinking about some of these issues at the broader level. So there will be a place where this information is all brought together in the coming months. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our lead facilitators for each group. I will call on you, and if you can unmute and share with us these main 3 points on the report out and anything else that comes up in 2 to 3 minutes. So first up, Laura Larson.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm just going to report out on a few select things in the different panels. In the first panel, in terms of what people noticed and what were areas of concern, we had some interesting discussion on some of the trade-offs that are apparent where restoration might create potential for larger habitat areas, but also more salinity intrusion, and changing the geometry might require some recalibration of what X2 means, and moving X2 regulatory targets as well. There was also some really interesting discussion on how some of the ways in which sassoon restoration was simulated in particular might be unrealistic. For example, it might be unrealistic to assume that this restoration is even possible without roping in landowners, and therefore how useful is this approach? It might set unrealistic expectations. There was a note that levees are likely to fail, or are more likely to fail on the bay side rather than on Montezuma Slough. And so that might create a more productive avenue for doing this sort of modeling. John DeGeorge was in our group and agreed that that was a really important consideration that should potentially be elevated, not just here, but potentially in Delta Adapts as well. For the metrics, there was a lot of interest in particular in the top metrics listed on the table: net flow, salinity, residence time. We had a lot of good discussion on metrics that are particularly relevant to understanding how habitat and benefit to native fishes might change, connections to harmful algal blooms as well. And then just quickly moving along to visualizations, a lot of interest in the 3 that were suggested, but also the other thing that really stood out was just a tremendous amount of interest in making this data available for potentially crowdsourced visualizations or use by third parties. And then finally, the last panel on future modeling research. Again, some interest in kind of bringing these tools to the masses, potentially through GPU processing to bring the 2D and 3D models to desktop computing. One really interesting idea was for a real-time salinity forecast tool, which could be of interest to folks on the ground who are interested in tracking X2, for which sensor data is not quite as useful. But modeling data with uncertainty would be really useful for structuring real-time operations. A lot of interest too in like using these tools in a deliberate fashion to think more systematically about how individual restoration projects have much larger scale impacts. But there was also a note that there's not really a mechanism right now from a policy perspective to take into account these larger scale impacts. And that those impacts are something that could help with prioritizing restoration. So I think I will leave it at that. Hopefully I didn't leave too much out.
Great, thank you, Laura. A lot to cover in a short time, so appreciate the summary. Next up, we have Ashok.
Hello. Yeah, a lot was discussed. It's hard to capture everything, but it's in the mural board. When it comes to the trade-offs, some of the results, some folks said like they are counterintuitive, so interested in learning more about that, and like interested in seeing some of the salinity changes further east into the delta. And many people commented on like the impacts to the channel bathymetry that these restoration projects would have. And someone even mentioned about like doing a study on like evaluating the effectiveness of maintaining the deep water ship channel because of the the traffic isn't there. Like I'm talking about the Sacramento ship channel because of the traffic and the potential for that channel to bring in salinity into the North Delta. So that's that. On the metrics and the visualizations, most people, comments that I have seen on the metrics are more related to, you need to, not many people understand what these metrics are about. So they wanted to have like a glossary in simple terms so anyone can understand what these metrics are about. And also like, these metrics have a positive change and negative change, and people are interested in understanding like, what a positive change in this metric would mean. Is that a good thing? And again, same thing. If a particular metric is negative, what does that mean? They're more interested in that. When it comes to visualizations, I think in addition to the current visuals, like, something like a storyboard or a Tableau or something, so people can easily see, filter based on the metrics is something that we discussed or came up. What else? Someone or like, we have many comments on making sure like, all this information is used by like, people who are interested right now, like whether it's schism or calcium. I have seen comments or heard comments about like only few people know how to use it. So like, questions came up about like, are there like, more trainings that would be offered for people who are interested so you can expand that like, modeler base. When it comes to the future research, I mentioned about the, deep water ship channel, like, people are interested in seeing like, if modeling can be done to evaluate the effectiveness of that, like, should we continue maintaining the channel, or does it even make sense? So, and someone mentioned about like, modeling is not just like one and done. You do this modeling, you learn something about it, then you like, it's an iterative process. You go on about it. So that's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ashok. And next up, Darcy.
All right. So we had a really good discussion, had a lot of questions and discussion about the models and the scenarios. But just to start out with our questions here, let's see here. So for the first question, we talked about how the changes in hydrodynamics, so things like, oh my God, my brain is not working. Things like tidal range and how that would affect things like cross delta water quality and whether or not it would enhance or maybe change the effects of aquatic weeds and harmful algal blooms. There was some question about clams as well, since those are related, the two different clam species are related to the salinity concentrations, and then also effects on things like fish migration, corridors, and survival. And there was, again, some discussion about scenarios and whether those were captured. So we left those in the sticky notes, won't report out on all of those here. As far as the metrics, we did have a lot of interest in many of the metrics. So you will see almost all of them have a check mark or a thumbs up. And residence time was one of the number ones, mean tide level, mean high water, and then tidal energy and mean low water. Just a note, we didn't know what point crossings were, so we didn't add any thumbs up there. So you will have to, maybe take that into consideration when you're taking a look at our results. In terms of visualizations, people were really interested in, or most interested, at least the most thumbs up, on time series. Also, the heat maps were really important. But we also added things like changes in salinity and temperature combined, sea level rise scenarios, and then seasonal patterns, so wet versus dry years. We did have some discussion about scenarios related to the water quality control plan updates, and maybe some of that additional work could inform those updates. Okay, and then the last question here for future modeling, I think the one that has the most is, how does new habitat restoration decrease total water supply? But then there's also future modeling notes here about the impact on the Sassoon Marsh salinity control gate operations. There's a need for Southern Delta salinity standards and compliance. And then there's one note here, sensitivity study using calcium to adjust export demands to see what it does to the ability to meet carryover storage requirements. So that's it for our group. Feel free to chime in, folks, if I left anything out that was important to mention.
Great, thank you, Darcy. And last but not least, Brett.
Sorry. So our group, kind of funny, we didn't really get into the trade-offs of the models. I think our group was really, really interested of like what is modeled, what can be modeled, what's prioritized in the model. And so we just let that conversation kind of roll out, which I think really got into a lot of like, what are the future modeling things that might be done. So I'll just skip to the second one here, metrics and visualizations. People are, I think, generally found them all quite useful. They really liked the animations, the time series and things like that, and thought they were useful. I think there's a few in our board of other things, but general found them effective and felt like they were communicating a lot of complex information. Some questions about location of major intakes and exports, also like the particle flow animations. But again, most of our conversation was really about like, what is being prioritized in the modeling, what could be added to it. Like one general question was, with these restorations, like how are we actually modeling, like how these parameters actually are modeled for the effectiveness of restoration, like the residence time and things like that, rather than salinity in and of itself. But if we're going to do these restorations, prioritizing that and sort of flipping some of the parameters there. A lot of questions about modeling different flow regimes and how that plays out over time. Lots of questions about stress testing around a full range of climate change scenarios, sea level rise, flooding, what happens when or if levees are breached under extreme flooding scenarios and things like that. So you can look through our mural board. Some things are not in the right place based on me trying to keep up with all the comments. But that was most of what I think our group really got into, was like what can be done with the modeling, and like what is the geographic scope of it as well, like what is outside the delta and how is that being brought into the modeling or is represented in the modeling. Yeah, I think that's most of what we discussed. If I've left anything out from our group, please speak up if it was important.
I think one thing that was mentioned was trade-offs between regions on things like tidal range and availability of habitat.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks very much to all of our group leaders for those report outs, really informative. And I think also really highlights this sort of multi-purpose of the multi-purpose outcomes of our of this modeling effort to date, which is, you know, part of what we're doing is seeing outputs on scenarios, but a lot of what's happening really is also just building out these models so that future questions can be answered. And that takes a considerable amount of time, but it's also really exciting to get you all interacting with these models when they're still in development. So yeah, I want to just reiterate thanks for the presentations of the modelers. And I do see we are at lunchtime now. I do see a comment in the chat from Deirdre Desjardins on considering adaptation recommendations in the face of uncertainty about climate change impacts from Mike Dettinger and Steve Culberson, internalizing climate change. Oh, that's the paper title. So yeah, and I think this was a theme that certainly came up across multiple groups that we're in, is that there's a chunk of things that we're able to address with our current tools, but in the future, there's certainly a need for broader tools that can accommodate a wider range of scenarios based on what we're seeing out there. So Deirdre, if you have anything to add to that comment, you should, I think you should be able to unmute. Oh, you unmuted briefly, but then muted again. So there we go. Great.
So I just wanted to emphasize that in the face of what we saw in 2023, which was a lot of extreme flooding around the world and a 0.5 degree step increase in temperature in September 2023 globally, that is a very rare event in the current generation of climate models, and they probably don't capture. We're starting to understand that there's some things that climate models don't capture. And so it's really important to think about extreme events. And Dettinger said, expect surprises. So to the extent that the solutions we're exploring, they need to be resilient to continuing extreme droughts like we saw in the past decade, potentially extreme flooding, and also we saw a huge loss in Antarctic sea ice, and we may be seeing a regime shift in Antarctic sea ice that started last year. So it's just a time of huge uncertainty, and extent the modeling can really look at resilience and not just focus on the center of the climate model projections. It's incredibly important. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for those thoughts. With that, we can go to the next slide. So just want to give you a little preview of what we'll be up to after lunch. We'll come back together at 12:40. We'll hear the presentation about co-design and modeling from Brett Milligan from UC Davis, do a quick wrap up, and then leave you all to explore and reflect. We've brought all of the results from our various murals across the workshop together in the same place. And so we'll have an open time that you're able to explore what other groups looked at, how they were thinking about these issues. And so with that, just to make sure everyone can grab a bite, we'll let you go to lunch, and we will see you back here at 12:40. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed it. We're happy to reconvene for the end of day 2, which will be the end of the 2024 Salinity Management Workshop. And so if you can go to the next slide. By way of just a brief reorientation, we will shortly transition over to hearing from Brett Milligan about co-design and modeling with some case study examples, as well as a little bit of discussion of future work. We will reconvene after Brett's talk and questions to discuss some of the next steps for after the workshop. And then lastly, we'll introduce to you all the large synthetic mural that I mentioned earlier, which will give you all a chance to weigh in and see what other groups have been thinking about throughout the last couple of days. So with that, I think we can transition over to Brett sharing his screen, and I'm happy to introduce Brett Milligan for our final talk of the day.
Thank you. Just give me 1 second, just setting up here. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. All right, thanks. Now, so the title of my talk is Co-Design and Modeling. And co-design or collaborative design typically refers to design in which any communities or people who might be impacted or affected or benefited from a design or planning effort is included in that process as part of the whole design and part of the decision making. And so I'm going to go over a project that's been mentioned a few times already, the Frank's Track Futures project that I and others worked on as an example of this and how that relates to a modeling process, particularly around salinity management. So I'm going to go through that project a little bit and just sort of give you a taste of that process. It was about a 1.5 year planning process and how we did that. And then I'll close with talking about sort of a follow-up project we're working on now and invite your participation in that one. Thanks to the other previous speakers who talked about Frank's Track, which has made my work a little easier. But if you are not familiar with Frank's Track, it's what's circled in the red dot here in the Central Delta. It's that watery thing you see there. And it's basically a large shallow lake created back in the 1930s, late 1930s, or a couple of levee breaks, and they went unrepaired. So it has sort of evolved from this kind of infrastructural accident. It's a state park. It's like a boating and hunting destination. You can see there's a lot of urbanization off to the south of it there on Bethel Island. But from a salinity point of view, Frank's Tract is a bit of a problem if you've been following the other presentations. Basically, with all that open water, it's a source of where you see us as the tract here and the modeling of it. Again, the salty water comes in through here, what some people refer to as the nozzle, and then distributes within all this water and then basically increases or enhances salinity intrusion into the delta as a whole, which impacts local water use as well as exports and water going elsewhere. So in 2017, U.S. Fish and Wildlife or California Fish and Wildlife and DWR teamed up to look at potential ways to fix this problem. And what you're seeing here was the initial idea of basically creating a mass of wetlands right up in the top portion of Frank's Tract to create a plug, basically an earthen mound that would stop that salinity from coming in. Hold on a second, I have a pack of wild dogs here, 1 second. Oh. Sorry about that. And so they put this, the idea was this plug would stop the salinity. It would also do another function of creating about 1,000 acres of tidal wetland for the habitat value and primary food production that would produce. And so this was modeled and, from a hydrodynamic point of view, and it actually worked really well. But the problem with this is it hadn't really been in any kind of consultation with the local community or how it might impact them. And so to give you a little sense of the place of Frank's Tract, you can see this, this is Bethel Island just to the south, and you can see all this development. Here's a view of that from a drone. And you can see all of this, all of these sort of a water-based community that is out here. This also gives you a sense of the scale of Frank's Tract. You're looking across it. And if you look really closely here, you can see a bunch of little hunting blinds out in the water. And these are the levee fragments from where breached. And basically the boating community gets to come through here and goes out onto here. These levee remnants kind of shield this whole area along all the marinas and stuff along this coastline. So it has a lot of waterfront development. This is one of the harbors that are along it. People boat here from all over the Bay Delta region. There are numerous world-class bass tournaments that are held out here throughout the year. So very much a boating destination as a place. It's again also a hunting destination in the fall. These are some of the duck hunters out there who set up these blinds, and this is administered by the state parks. And so this place has a lot of place value, and this is sort of a mock-up of what that proposal would do in terms of creating that marsh plug that would go in there. And this was really not favorable to the community because it would sort of mostly destroy what they do in terms of using the water and sealing them in and blocking that off. They also really like having the open water near their residential their homes. And so from there, we took a step back and basically started over. And this is what became called the Franks Track Futures Project. And so we started by really remapping, like, what is this place and how is it used and inhabited? And so part of that was creating a survey that people could do, a geospatial survey, where we asked people things like, what are your boating routes through the tract? And people could use this on their phone or on a computer, and you could actually, detail out where you boat. We asked people how they identified. We asked them if there were locations where marsh could be put into the tract that wouldn't bother them. We asked them, where do you recreate and what kind of activities do you do? Which you can see is diverse and distributed all around the tract. We asked them where they launched their boat, where was more public access needed. And perhaps most significantly, we asked them, are there things that you'd want to see changed? Because a lot of people had said they didn't want to see anything change, but yet, these are all polygons that people drew, saying where they thought things could be improved, such as boating hazards, some of the invasive aquatic weeds that make boating really difficult, public access and things like this. So this kind of mapping and modeling of the landscape then became a basis for the design, which basically we expanded out what the design criteria were. This started as a Delta Smelt resiliency project and then expanded to think about a sort of broader synthetic, notion of ecology that included smelt, but also salmon, sport fish, as well as thinking about birds and waterfowl, so more comprehensively. And then most importantly, added this middle portion, this community and place goals around maintaining navigation, navigability by boat, enhancing recreation, and also trying to support the local economy and flood protection. Along with still trying to meet these water quality goals that the state agencies had in mind. So this was our challenge going into this project. Could this even be done? Which is not something we really knew going into it. Who was involved? We had a steering committee, which are basically the agencies potentially involved in decision-making around this project. So I'm not gonna go through all these people. I'm just giving you a flavor here of the different agencies that were involved. And this was combined with an even larger advisory committee. And again, this is where the other part of that co-design came in. These were people who were potentially going to be impacted by this project, whether it was the local marinas, the local water agencies, some of the, like a pro fisherman, the Strat Bass Association, all of these folks were part of our advisory committee. And so we came together over a year and a half to try to see if we could come up with something that might meet all of these different objectives. And so these next couple of slides is a diagram of our process again, which was about over a year and a half from 2019 to 2020. And so you see there, we started off with a public meeting to try to tell people what we were trying to do. And we launched that survey. And then we had our first advisory committee meetings where we came into it with a broad range of potential scenarios, whether that's the do nothing scenario, and then 6 other potential options of what we might do in terms of thinking about different placements of those land masses or creating wetlands, again, for salinity attenuation, but also for like in ways that could be arranged that wouldn't detrimentally impact the communities. And so from that, we got people who voted for their top ones, and that narrowed it down to 3 possible scenarios of how these land massings could go, combined again with the no action scenario that was taken throughout this entire process. So basically, this was each time we would, have our working group and the public select which things they liked, and then we would go back and refine them. Eli, who you heard from this morning, and his team would then try to model them, and we created this iterative process of trying to refine these different designs. So this is, you heard Eli talk this morning. This is Eli hard at work at one of our advisory committee meetings, we basically combined our steering committee and our advisory committee at these meetings. And here he's going through like the first or second round of the results we got from modeling these different types of configurations. And you see there in the audience, there's a local resident asking questions about the modeling and actually, rectifying what he sees on the ground from a boating perspective. So it was this co-learning that I think happened a lot in our meetings. I would say for me personally, like the meetings themselves were probably were the most productive things we did, or most useful, where we'd get together, we would bring in some of these concepts, trace paper, markers, and just hash it out, like what was working, what wasn't, details of the landforms, how they should be designed, down to these little peninsulas and things like that, where you're trying to get multi-benefit out of these from the boating perspective, as well as trying to still attenuate salinity. So again, you won't be able to digest all this right now, but it's a diagram showing sort of how these sort of blobs you're seeing in Frank's tract were actually quite parametric in terms of there was all these different parameters that we were trying to shape them with, whether that was from the ecologists, the recreationists, fish biologists, Eli and his team, and the residents of like what they wanted. So trying to combine all of these to figure out what kinds of solutions might work. As we started to develop that, a big thing for the local community was recreational benefits and how could those be provided in this rather than it just being a detrimental impact in their community. So this is an example from some of our UC Davis landscape architecture students who really were sort of looking at some of the land forming and where beaches might be created, recreational beaches and coves for boating, sheltered areas, and then sort of the features that would be designed into those. And then we took these to, they took their concepts back to the community and had them look at them and evaluate them and, say like, does this work or does this not work? What do you like? And you see on the left there, that's an example of one of the feedback forms we gave them in terms of like the citing of these features, whether they worked or not, what they liked. There's also attunement to aesthetics and what people actually, want to see and experience in the landscape. So we asked them about, what kind of channels do you like? What do you think of as an appealing marsh and things like that as part of the design. So what we ended up with was, again, three design options that all actually worked from a salinity attenuation perspective, plus the no action alternative. And again, what these designs are showing is what you see in the green. This is where it's basically a cut and fill operation that would be done through dredging, where these darker areas are where the borrow material comes from, where you would dig deeper down into the tract and then stack it up to make these marshes at tidal elevation. And the darker colors are upland areas. So these are the different configurations of those. One that really pushes everything up into the north. And again, this is the barrier, right? It just has this opening here. So it's stopping salinity from getting down here. This one is the central landmass where you're basically making the tract into two small, or the Frank's tract into two smaller water bodies. And then this one, which pushes everything as far as you can to the west, to the east, away from Bethel Island. So we took all of those and we then put them back out to the public. We launched another online survey. And this is just an example showing some of the responses we got to one particular design. This is that central landmass. And what you see on this side are things that people liked, and then on this side dislikes, and then sort of their questions and things. So I'm just showing this to give you a sense of the depth of the information and feedback we got on all of these scenarios. And the central landmass was the preferred one. We actually found that all of the proposed designs seemed more favorable than the status quo. And again, just to briefly explain this, these are those deepened areas you see in the darker, and then these are the tidal marshes. These are the ways you navigate through on your boat. So you can come through this way, get out this corner, go out that way, and then up through here. And these are showing some of the features for the community. These are like, this is designed for boating, like a sheltered area with a beach here and some day use areas. And these are the features for that over here. So how did we actually go through the process of deciding what the objectives were of this project? We used a structured decision-making process with some of the consultants on the team. And these were the overall, basically 7 different categories that were decided upon as being the priorities, both from the local community and from the agency point of view. And then we would evaluate all these across all of them. So one of the biggest parameters are these channels that would cut through the marsh, right? If you make them too wide, you don't get the salinity attenuation because the salt's just going to go through. If you make them too narrow, they're not attractive to or they're unsafe for the boating community. So again, this is where Eli and his team iteratively tried different widths and different parameters for these channels, and we ended up hitting a sweet spot around 100 meters wide, which is sort of a standard channel size in the Delta roughly. And so this is showing some of the modeling here of these with these channels. You see the 3 different options across here. This is the preferred one in the middle, showing that salinity, attenuation where it's held up here and doesn't disperse. And also Eli was modeling velocity as well, where this is the given condition again, where that you have this nozzle coming in. And then as you see in the preferred design, the redder areas are higher velocity. It's sort of dispersed and slowed down. So in some ways, this is ideal because you get some scouring of these channels, which can hopefully prevent sedimentation and some of the weed infestation. But you don't want it to be too fast because then it makes a hazard for boating. So these are some of the improvements we tried to make to navigability. But we weren't just modeling the hydrodynamics of all this and the salinity, but also these other parameters from a community perspective. I'm just going to show a couple examples again. This was from the boating perspective, and you can see in the no action alternative, you have the most efficiency across the track, right? You can just shoot across from where you want, and these are the main lines of travel that boaters use. And then we basically compared the scenarios to see, how much added time do you get across, all of these. And we actually measured these out and, worked them out in AutoCAD and all of that kind of stuff to see how they compared. Again, just giving you a sample, this is just in recreation, how we were assessing all these across like fishing access, motorized boating, non-motorized boating, shoreline recreation, and waterfowl hunting. By diversifying this landscape, there would be new opportunities that were created for hunting, which we were trying to model in these diagrams, as well as you'd lose some of the open water hunting and sort of taking stock of that. So this is just a few examples of some of the renderings from the project of some of these beaches and sort of sheltered coves and things that would be created in the project. It would sort of diversify hunting and fishing opportunities. You're seeing a marsh channel up at the top, and then some of the in-marsh hunting opportunities that might be available, as well as diversifying the ecology of the tract. I mean, in general, this project would diversify the types of habitats from being somewhat homogeneous right now as a inundated tract, and again trying to accommodate for all these different species. Am I doing time? So again, this is what came out of this project. This was a preferred alternative. There's still questions of how this might go forward, how it will be funded, but there was a lot of I would say support for this and as a multi-benefit adaptation project to meet multiple needs and as well as to serve the local community. So that's Frank's Track Futures in a nutshell. And just briefly, I wanted to touch on sort of a project, I would say, that kind of continues in the same vein. And this is called Just Transitions in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. It's a UC multi-campus research program project. And in this one, we're basically some ways scaling up from Frank's Track to look at comparative salinity management scenarios for the Delta across a range of parameters, and a lot of what's been discussed over these last 2 days. And central to what we're trying to do here is a participatory scenario planning process where trying to get publics and communities involved to help us decide what are the scenarios we want to run or really research, and doing a lot of outreach around that, and then to try to model them. And basically the hope here is that we build some shared learning and visioning around, what are the different trade-offs and benefits of different management strategies, and can we build trust and capacity around that through a sort of open, independent kind of way of looking at this. And so this is part of what we're testing, if we can do this. And this is just a preliminary thought on some of the parameters or some of the scenarios we'll be looking at. We're still building these out and talking to different stakeholders and communities to see what people are interested in. But we have sort of the more landscape or nature-based solutions, such as what I'm calling targeted green infrastructure, or something like the Frank's Track Futures, where it's a very strategic insertion versus what you saw this morning of like systemic staged restoration. Like, how could you do restoration overall in a way that helps with managing salinity. There's also different types of land use, subsidence reversal techniques too within tracts that are still levied. And then we have the more hard engineering solutions, such as temporary salinity barriers, this notion like a freshwater pathway through the delta, conveyance infrastructure, operable salinity gates, and then the legal mechanisms, such as changes in flow requirements, changes in reservoir operations, changes in water rights, demand export reduction, and thinking about indigenous sovereignty and water rights. We see another one there, which is other. We're open to other ideas or other things that might come on the table, but these are just preliminary. These are just the range of what we might be able to look at. And then with all of these, and this has came up in my group today about the modeling, is really stress testing these and see how they compare and how they compare to one another in terms of severe drought, potential flooding or levee failure in different future climate scenarios. So these would be something we would test across all of them. Again, our team is from 4 campuses, Davis, Berkeley, San Diego, and Merced, and we're working with outside collaborators as well. And this is just a diagram showing some of our different sub-teams as we go through this, again, all built around this participatory scenario planning process. This is a diagram of our process between, we got going in 2023 and we go through 2027. So basically our project begins with a lot of background research, a lot of public and stakeholder outreach, and then we basically move through a series of 3 workshops developing these different scenarios and basically starting with which scenarios do we want to run, and then basically modeling and going into greater depth on all of those as we work our way through, leading to an overall comparative understanding of these different potential adaptations. And so where we are right now is we're coming up on the first workshop. We have been hard at work doing a lot of interviews and some outreach and doing more and more on the ground in the Delta, as well as surveys. And so our first workshop is scheduled for Tuesday, June 11th. I would like to welcome all of you here if you are interested in this to join us. We'll be at the Big Break Visitor Center down near Oakley. And you can, if you want to right now, you can just put your phone up on here. It'll take you right to our website. At our website, you can ask to be interviewed. You can also, we now have a survey up there if you just want to take 10 minutes or 15 minutes to tell us what scenarios you think we should be running. Or if you want more, if you want to register for the public workshop, you can there. With that, I'm done. I can take questions if there are any.
Great, thank you, Brett. So there's one question, or there's 2 questions in the chat here. I'll start with the first one. Where will the fill come from for the Frank's Tract projects? And noting that fill is also needed to raise existing delta levees to keep up with increased peak flood flows and sea level rise.
Yeah, for the Frank's Tract features one, it was, I didn't really make this super clear. The idea is it was all cut and fill, be all in the tract. And the big benefit you get that I didn't mention, when you dig down, if you go deep enough, we were actually thinking going pretty deep, you actually get to the point where the aquatic weeds it's too dark for them. They can't, there's too much water column that they don't grow. So you'd actually be improving navigability by going down. And so you'd be pulling from the tract and stacking it up within it. And Moffett and Nickel were our engineers who did, that was their specialty in looking into that. And so you wouldn't really be importing, it'd be all local.
Great, thanks. The next question is, I think that you answered this really with the engagement here and the outreach around just transitions, but there was a question saying the content gathering for the Just Transitions project misses some important historic and regulatory context. Is there a way to provide some more information?
Sorry, can you read that last part again? I kind of missed what you said.
Yeah, so the last part is just, is there a way to provide more information?
Sure, yeah. I mean, if we're missing something, that's definitely something we'd like to include. I will say we're in the process of adding a story map to our website that's in production, where we're trying to list out some of these things. So if you have some suggestions there for us of things that we can include about the history, that'd be very helpful. Please pass it along.
Yeah, and Brett, maybe once you're done, in addition to the QR codes, you could just pop a direct link in the chat as well in case folks have any trouble accessing QR codes.
If you just hit Just Transitions Delta, it should come up for you too.
Great. So yeah, next question is, what will the stress testing look like for the Just Transitions project?
That is still in development. We have a hydrodynamic and climate modeling team, and that is something we're trying to look at. And I mean, one of the big questions there is sort of designing a drought for that project, to like basically, a longer scale drought of the things that we're thinking are probably more likely. We're still working out like what are the climate scenarios to run with that as well. So we're still a little earlier right now of just trying to figure out what are the scenarios in terms of like that's where a lot of our work is right now, a lot of the outreach we've been doing. And some of that is also asking folks about what sort of stressors and climate scenarios and things like that. So I don't have a final answer on that. And I'd like to connect you with some of our people who are more the experts with that. But yeah, we are still working on developing what that would be.
Great. And then an additional question, is there a way to have input on the drought scenarios? Yeah. I mean, so part of it, you can, if you'd like to do an interview or if you just want to get in touch with me, I'm happy to chat. And also we have a survey, and part of that survey is asking folks like, what do you see as the biggest drivers, or what things would you like to know more about, or whatever. You can weigh in that. That's a new thing we've just added to the website. If you go there under participate. And so those are things you could add there, or just feel free to get in contact directly. Great, thank you, Brett. And it's great to see how this work has sort of developed in parallel, but does certainly address a lot of the feedback that we heard from participants at the first workshop about just the need for a broader understanding of these perspectives in a systematic way in the system. So thank you so much. And I think we're not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So a big virtual round of applause for Brett. Brett, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. Yeah, great to hear a little bit more about the Just Transitions project, as well as Frank's Track for those who aren't familiar already.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, so that brings us to sort of our closing and final activity for the day. So we can switch over to Stephen's screen now. And so yeah, okay, great. So a few things before we dive into this closing mural. The first thing here is that we did just want to make sure everyone's aware that there will be we'll be developing some sort of summary product to really take a look at things we heard from both the 2022 and the 2024 Salinity Management Workshop. So that's something that you can keep an eye out for, to see a lot of what we talked about today reflected in this sort of summary document. We will also be making all the materials. We've got a few questions throughout these 2 days, and so we just wanted to repeat that we will be making all the materials from this workshop available to folks. So presentations, as well as videos. It might take a little bit for us to get through all that and get them shared and posted, but all of those materials will be available. And then lastly, the sort of closing mural that Stephen will walk us through in just a moment. We'll also be leaving that open for folks because I think especially if you have any colleagues that weren't able to attend these 2 days, but might be interested in watching pieces on the video and then continuing to add notes. We do really want to make sure that this opportunity for engagement is left open for people. So this mural will be accessible, and we'll circulate links and materials with all folks who have registered. So I think the last thing I want to note before I hand it over to Stephen is also that we've discussed having a follow-up conversation, shorter, likely a shorter event once the modeling results are a little more advanced, just if folks are interested in checking in to see where they've come sort of since all of the work that's been presented today. So we'll be sure to circulate any announcements about that with our listservs from both the first and the second workshops. And so keep an eye out on your inbox for all of that. And so with that, I will hand it over to Stephen to walk us through our final step for the day.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dylan. And thank you everyone for sticking around for this last bit. I know it's been a long couple of days, so we really appreciate your time and energy as we sort of wrap up these conversations. So as we've sort of said a couple of times, we wanted to just give people a chance to really explore and reflect on some of the content that other groups have been producing throughout the 2 days in case, I mean, obviously everyone was in their own individual breakout groups and we had report outs, but it's different to actually see what people created. So we wanted to put everything together in one mural so you could see all of the output from each of the day's breakout groups. So I'm going to have Dylan put the link to that in the chat, but I'll just orient you to it here. So it's in the center. There are just a couple of just general synthesis questions for you to reflect on and answer as you'd like. Just you can answer using these sticky notes. So you just click into these sticky notes, you type whatever you like. So the questions that we sort of want you to think about are what stood out to you from your conversations from the last 2 days? What are other gaps that you think are important to address or explore? And do you have any other thoughts or questions about salinity management? And so after you see that, you can also just go around, zoom out, and you'll see all of the output from both of the day's breakout groups. So there are the conceptual models, there are the actor maps, and you can zoom in as you like. Some of it might be a little blurry, so we apologize for that. It was sort of a challenge to get everything all into one mural, so we had to unfortunately cut some corners. But if you want to add additional sticky notes, we've populated extra sticky notes along the periphery of all of these different breakout group images. So you can also populate new sticky notes if you'd like. So what we want is for you to just spend some time looking at what all these other groups have come up with, adding more notes if you like. And then, yeah, just responding to these general synthesis questions here in the center of the mural. And we will be here on the call until 1:45 in case you have any questions that come up. We're happy to try and tackle them. We're also asking that hopefully all of the speakers that we've had over the last 2 days are able to stick around on the call for a little while longer in case you have a question that is that they are better suited to answer. So I would say just have at it on the mural, add your comments, add additional just responses to these questions. If you have direct questions for us, please put them in the chat, raise your hands, put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them as best we can. And if you are feeling done, feel free to log off. There's no more presentation. The content sort of portion of the workshop is over. So you can feel free to log off. You won't be missing any more presentations or anything like that. So yeah, I think that's all I really wanted to say.
And thanks again to all of our presenters. We really appreciate it. Very informative couple days. I see a hand from Deirdre Desjardins.
I just put it in the chat as well, but if in future workshop, it would be really helpful to hear directly from the climate scientists who are providing advice on climate modeling. And the last couple of years, we've really started to see there's some big uncertainties about trends observed. The climate models don't agree with some major observed trends in the Pacific. That's a driver of temperature and precipitation in California. And Dr. Larson alluded to that, but it's just hand wavy and, oh, you know, the climate scientists are dealing with it. But having those folks actually here, it's climate change is an incredibly important piece of this, and particularly using the best available science. So it's really hard when there isn't even an opportunity to talk to or hear how that's being in detail, how it's being addressed.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Deirdre. And if you do have any ideas about people, you know, I encourage you to leave a comment in the mural as well, particularly if there's ideas for specific folks that we might be able to reach out to about this. That would be helpful for us. So thanks for that feedback. Gregory.
And unmute. Hi, yes, I have a calcium question related to the Delta Conveyance project, and I thought maybe Eli or Lily or some of the modelers could help me with, if they're still online.
We're on, but I think only a very small slice of problems would be you know, I could only answer things about a relatively small.
It really more general. That in the petition, it has a statement talking about the maximum amount of water the SWP would divert is estimated at 4.8 million acre feet based on modeled results over a 94-year range representing historic hydrology. Now that sounds like calcium results from the existing conditions run, and I didn't think you could use that as an absolute value. I thought you more used those to compare two scenarios, and I wanted to get some feedback on that.
I don't have feedback for you. I could dig up the right person to answer that if you'd like.
Who would? Okay, can you do that?
Yeah, I'll try and put you in contact with the right person. I'd be outside of yeah.
Okay, great. And then one other thing real quick, and maybe more for the is salinity management and the in delta salinity modeling. Is with regards to historical conditions and looking at water rights and looking at specifically when they curtail people, they're doing that based on the statement that there would not have been sufficient water quality to meet their needs given, and that's based on their priority of water rights. So that would be pre-project, you know, for some of these older guys. And so what I was, you know, is something, not so much a data gap, but maybe something that could be looked at because, you know, the water board is trying to model this and do this, is what would the salinity conditions, you know, the EC conditions down in the Southern Delta be without the projects back in, you know, say if you're going to do a 1916 priority or a 19, you know, let's just say 1916, because there's a license out there with that priority. Would they have had water quality or not? And the reason I say that, I can look at the reports of licensee from 1932, where after 3 consecutive critical years, their concern with water was the Great Depression. They were not concerned with water quality, and that's from all the reports in the state water board's files. So I think that looking at that historically, since the water board is looking to curtail people based on, you know, that the fact they, you know, their modeling shows without the project operations, they wouldn't have sufficient water quality. I think, you know, that the current models are not valid to show that. So anyway, those are my comments, and thank you for the all the presentations. This was very useful. What's it? Seminar, or whatever it was. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that comment, Gregory. Deirdre, I wasn't sure if this was a new hand or your old hand from before. And I do see your comment in the
It's
chat as
just,
well. Yeah.
so I did have some information that's related to that. So my research background is in nonlinear dynamics and chaos theory and complex systems theory. And there's a lot about this that was sort of screaming regime shift to me about what's been happening with the 21st century climate. And so inspired by Stephen Ramsdorff, I went and did a nonlinear trend analysis using a 30-year lowest curve of all of the climate division data for temperature and precipitation. And wow, we have a big, unlike the linear trend, we have a big declining trend in precipitation, and a nonlinear increase in temperature is almost double that of the linear increase that's being used for indicators of climate change in California. And I've been in discussions with them as well. So I provided a link to the report. I provided it to the water board. And I think there's a line of evidence that I've been assembling, and I can try and suggest some people you talk to that it's related to these trends in the Pacific that really aren't being captured by the current generation of climate models. So an observational, this is why I said, how can someone have input into the drought scenario? Because there's some reasons to think that the trends we saw in the last decade, which were drier even, I broke it out by Pacific to Cattle oscillation period for people who are wonky, but the trends are drier than that epoch that included the Dust Bowl era drought. Or the dries are drier and they're also a lot hotter. So he's absolutely right in the sense, I don't think perturbing, there's a current thing where if you perturb each individual year and perturb the calcium inputs, I don't think that works. So it's very foundational to all the modeling you're doing. And I think I'd really like to be able, Richard Seeger, who is the grand old man of Southwest drought research, recommended a storyline approach where current trends would continue. And I think the Colorado River Basin folks are way ahead of us on recognizing that they're in the middle of climate change and that some of the drying trends are going to continue. So anyway, I'll shut up. I don't want to take too much bandwidth, but I did provide a link to my report if you want to see the actual trends. And I'm going to look at runoff too.
Great, thank you for that, Deirdre. Eli, did you want to share?
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, one way to, since climate is so uncertain, one way to sort of bracket and stress test from kind of the other end of things is to just create a realistic looking end stage drought year and kind of look at what the, you know, the final months look like, so to speak, and see how far you can stretch a certain volume of water without having to come up with the context of how that drought came in. It's only a piece because everything that Deirdre is talking about is super relevant as well, as far as how frequently we would find ourselves in that boat and all that. But some of the characteristics of how operators react can be sort of you know, you can create storylines about that without a larger climate context, and I think, you know, it might be useful to do that a little bit. And I think that in the original conception of this project, you know, when people were talking about like, you know, how long can we stretch things out? This example that I'm talking about, it just kind of takes that a little bit farther.
Great, yeah, thanks for that reply, Eli. So folks, we'll be leaving the Zoom open for another 5 minutes or so, and the mural will stay open. So please continue to add anything there afterwards. But yeah, we'll be here for a few more. Okay, great. Well, thanks again so much to everyone. Thanks to those of you who are sticking around and continuing to put stuff in the mural. Please continue to engage. We will go ahead and close the Zoom now and just say a big thanks again to everybody. So enjoy the rest of your day.